Joe Colombo sat in his dimly lit office, the thick scent of cigar smoke curling into the air. He had a reputation, one forged in the underworld. But tonight, even he could feel the shift. "You've got one chance to make things right," Joe said, his voice low, almost to himself, as he ran a finger along the edge of his desk. The room seemed too quiet, too still. A long, drawn-out ring broke the silence. Joe's hand hovered over the phone, the weight of the decision heavy on him. He finally picked it up. The voice on the other end was frantic, the words tumbling over each other. "Colombo, the FBI's closing in. They're on to us." A long pause. Joe's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanor hiding the fury building beneath the surface. He leaned back in his chair, the dim light catching the sharp angles of his face. "I'll handle it," he replied, his voice cold as ice. This wasn't just another day in his life, it was a reckoning. As soon as the phone call ended, Joe's thoughts were clouded with a sense of urgency. The FBI was getting closer to dismantling everything he'd built. His fingers lingered over a folder buried deep within his desk, filled with names of people who had sworn loyalty to him. But Joe knew, he had seen it before, loyalty was a fleeting thing. The file revealed one name, highlighted in red ink: Salvatore. His trusted underboss, the man who was supposed to be untouchable. But the FBI had found their way into Salvatore's life. Joe's face tightened as he picked up the file. "Traitor," Joe muttered, his voice seething with rage. He knew he couldn't let this go. Salvatore would pay, but the question remained. How much had he already revealed to the FBI? Joe sat in his chair, the weight of the decision heavy on his chest. He had made it this far by playing by his own rules. Undubbied, untwiled, Marseilles. But now, the walls were closing in. He could feel the pressure mounting with every tick of the clock, every creak of the chair beneath him. The FBI had always been a step behind, but this time, they were different. This time, they were getting too close. Joe's thoughts flickered to his family, his wife, his children. Could they be caught in the fallout of his choices? He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. "This isn't just about me anymore," he said to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. He had to act quickly, decisively, or everything would be lost. The phone rang again. This time, it was Salvatore, his voice shaky, betraying a fear that Joe hadn't heard before. "Joe, we need to talk," he said, his words scrambling over each other. Joe's eyes narrowed. He had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier. He had trusted Salvatore, and now, betrayal was knocking at his door. Joe's fingers tightened around the phone as he leaned forward in his chair. "You have one chance to explain yourself," he said, his voice hard as stone. There was no room for weakness now. He had no choice but to deal with Salvatore. His fate was already sealed. Joe's only question now was how to keep control of everything else. Salvatore entered the office, his hands slightly raised, his body language desperate. He was trying to show he wasn't a threat, but the tension in the room was thick. "Joe, I swear I didn't do anything," Salvatore pleaded, but his voice quivered and his eyes darted around nervously. Joe didn't flinch. He knew better than to believe the words coming from a man he had once called his most trusted underboss. Joe rose from his chair, the gun hidden beneath the desk a reminder of the kind of business he was in. "Save it, Joe," said his voice sharp. "You were always too weak for this life." He pulled the gun out of the drawer, aiming it straight at Salvatore's chest. "You had your chance, Salvatore. Now you'll pay." The tension in the air was thick as Joe Colombo gathered his men around a large table, in a dimly lit room. The sharp scent of cigars and leather filled the space as every face in the room was focused on him. Joe's voice broke the silence, strong and unwavering. "We show no mercy," he said, the words heavy with authority. "The FBI thinks they can take me down, but they have no idea what they're up against." His men nodded in agreement, but even as they showed their loyalty, Joe could feel the undercurrent of fear beneath the surface. The FBI was closing in faster than he anticipated, and his empire was beginning to fracture. Trust was a fragile thing. and even the men who had sworn allegiance to him were becoming uncertain. The room felt colder as the realization hit. Joe was no longer the untouchable boss he once was. The walls were closing in, and everyone knew it. Outside, the FBI was closing in with relentless determination. Special Agent Andrews sat at his desk, staring at the map of the city, his finger tracing the pins that marked Colombo's known locations. His team had been tracking Joe for months, but they had always been one step behind. "He's playing us like a game," Andrews muttered under his breath. But not for long. The plan was simple. They would hit him hard, take down his operations one by one. They had the evidence they needed. They had the manpower. Now, all they had to do was wait for the right moment. The case against Colombo was solid, but Andrews knew the man was dangerous. He would fight to the bitter end. "Prepare yourselves. We strike tonight," Andrews ordered, his voice filled with cold resolve. As the agents gathered their things, Andrews looked out the window, knowing the battle that was about to unfold would either make or break his career. Joe sat alone in his office, staring at the file on his desk. The flickering lamp above him cast strange shadows on the walls as he thought about the next move. The FBI was close, too close, and Salvatore's betrayal had made everything even more complicated. Joe's mind raced through the options. The betrayals were stacking up, and the empire he had built was slipping through his fingers. He had to act quickly. His thoughts turned to his family, the ones he swore to protect above all else. Could he keep them safe in the storm that was coming? He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of his decision settle in. His hand hovered over the phone, ready to make a call that could change everything. But first, he needed to know who he could trust. The answer was clear: no one. His empire was built on trust, and now it was shattered. He was in this fight alone. A knock on the door interrupted Joe's thoughts. It was Johnny, one of his most trusted men, his face grim. He stepped into the office, holding a briefcase that was too important to be ignored. "It's time, Joe. We have to move now," Johnny said, his voice tense. Joe's eyes narrowed as he slowly rose from his chair. His mind was already in motion, calculating every step. "We'll hit them where it hurts," Joe said, his voice cold and calculating. "The FBI thinks they've won, but they're wrong." Johnny opened the briefcase and slid a stack of documents onto the desk, a grim look crossing his face. "Everything's in place. If we do this right, we can flip the tables on them." Joe scanned the documents, his gaze hardening as he read. It was time to make his move. The clock was ticking, and the pressure to act had never been higher. Joe's plan was in motion. His men were already in place, positioned at key locations throughout the city, their eyes on the FBI's every move. The streets had been mapped, and every potential route was already accounted for. Joe could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he didn't flinch. This was his world, and the FBI was just another enemy to be dealt with. His men moved like clockwork, the precision of their actions reflecting Joe's meticulous planning. The FBI might think they were in control, but Joe was always a step ahead. "They won't know what hit them," Joe muttered to himself as he looked out the window, watching the city pass by. He was prepared for whatever the FBI had planned, but he was also ready to make his final play. The game was far from over. Joe Colombo sat in the back of the black sedan, the city lights streaking past in a blur. He'd spent years building this empire, an empire founded on trust, loyalty, and respect. But now, as the FBI closed in and his own men grew nervous, Joe was starting to feel the cracks in his foundation. His hand rested on the briefcase, containing the final details of his counterattack. He had to keep moving, stay ahead of the FBI's relentless pursuit. But the betrayal of Salvatore still haunted him. His mind kept returning to that night, the way Salvatore's eyes had flickered with fear, his last desperate plea for mercy. "You can't trust anyone anymore," Joe muttered under his breath, his voice filled with bitter regret. The thought gnawed at him, but there was no time for second-guessing. His men depended on him. He couldn't afford to falter. The FBI would be coming for him soon, but Joe was prepared to fight with everything he had. The FBI was closing in faster than Joe had anticipated. Special Agent Andrews stood before a large board covered with photos, maps, and connections, the threads between them all leading back to Joe. "We're getting closer," Andrews muttered, his eyes scanning the evidence. The frustration of months of dead ends and false leads was beginning to show. But now, they were finally zeroing in on Joe's network. The operation was moving faster than anyone expected. Andrews knew that they couldn't afford to make mistakes. This was their last chance. The pressure was mounting. One wrong move, and the entire operation would crumble. Andrews clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He had spent too long on this case to back down now. "Get ready, we're going in," he ordered. The agents around him moved swiftly, preparing for the final strike. The walls were closing in on Joe Colombo, and this time, there would be no escape. Joe's phone buzzed, the vibration cutting through the silence of the car. He glanced at the screen. "Johnny." His stomach tightened as he answered. "Joe, it's bad. We're compromised," Johnny said, his voice low and hurried. Joe's grip on the phone tightened, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean, compromised?" Joe asked, his voice steady but the panic rising inside him. Johnny hesitated. "There's someone on the inside, Joe. We've been feeding information to the FBI for months. Someone close to us." Joe's blood ran cold. His men had always been his strength, his rock. To think that one of them was turning against him was a betrayal he couldn't afford. The anger surged inside him, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't afford to be reckless now. "Find out who. And if they're still in this, get rid of them. No one betrays me," Joe said through gritted teeth. The phone call ended, and Joe sat back in his seat, a cold rage building inside him. He had no room for weakness. Not now, not ever. Johnny and the others were already on the move. Joe's empire, once a well-oiled machine, was now fraying at the edges. The uncertainty about the mole had sent ripples through his crew. The betrayal, though unconfirmed, was eating away at the loyalty he had spent so long cultivating. Joe couldn't afford to waste time looking back. He had to keep moving forward. His eyes never left the road ahead as the car continued down the dark streets. "We have to hit them before they hit us," Joe said, his voice a low growl. "This operation is too important. No more mistakes." The city lights flickered as the car turned onto another street, its headlights slicing through the night. Joe's men were prepared, but how much did they really know? The uncertainty gnawed at him. As they neared their destination, Joe's thoughts returned to his family, his wife, his children. Would they survive this war? Would he survive it? He couldn't answer that yet. All he knew was that he had to fight until the end, no matter the cost. The car came to a stop in front of a nondescript building. It was a safe house, a place where Joe had stored weapons and supplies in case of a situation like this. His men gathered around, moving quickly and efficiently. Joe's eyes scanned the building, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. "Stay sharp," he warned, his voice a low whisper. "We don't know who's watching us yet." His men nodded, moving into position. Joe's thoughts were still consumed with the mole. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone close to him was betraying him. But he had no time to dwell on it now. The FBI was closing in. They were running out of time. Joe motioned for his men to move in, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step felt like a countdown, and there was no turning back. This was the point of no return. Whatever happened now would change everything. Joe stood at the window of the safe house, his eyes scanning the darkened streets below. The silence of the night felt oppressive. The quiet before the storm. He'd thought he had it all under control, but now the weight of the situation was crashing down on him. His men were positioned, but there was something in the air, a sense of impending doom. His thoughts drifted to his family. His wife and children were safe, for now, but for how long? Every decision Joe made now felt like a step closer to losing everything. The betrayal, the mole within his ranks, haunted him. "We can't afford to let our guard down," Joe muttered, his voice cold and detached. The world was closing in around him. The FBI, his men, and even the traitor within. Everyone was part of the same relentless pressure. "We're going to end this now, one way or another," he said, his words steely with resolve. It was do or die, and Joe knew he wasn't going down without a fight. The radio crackled, breaking the silence in the room. Johnny's voice came through, urgent and clipped. "Joe, we've got a problem. They're here." Joe's heart skipped a beat. The FBI had found them. This was it, the moment they'd been preparing for. But Joe wasn't afraid. He had built his empire on moments like these, and he would fight until his last breath. His men moved quickly, taking their positions with military precision. "Keep calm," Joe ordered. "Stick to the plan. We hit them hard, we hit them fast." The sound of boots shuffling, men taking cover, echoed through the building. Joe's hand rested on the grip of his gun, his fingers itching with the need to act. Outside, the night seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the storm to break. "Let's finish this," Joe whispered to himself. The fight was far from over, and Joe wasn't going to let the FBI take him without a fight. The door to the building slammed open, and the FBI stormed in, guns raised. Chaos erupted as gunfire rang out, echoing through the narrow hallways. Joe's men were ready, firing back with precision. Joe's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained clear, focused. He moved swiftly, his movements a blend of grace and deadly intent. The FBI had underestimated him, thinking they could break him down. They had no idea what they were up against. Joe was in his element now. This was a fight for survival. He ducked behind cover, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of weakness. "They think they can scare us," Joe muttered, "but I'm not the one who's afraid." His gun flashed in the dim light, sending another agent to the ground. But in the back of his mind, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that this fight was only going to get worse. The FBI wasn't just here for him. They were here to destroy everything he had built. Amid the chaos, Joe caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd, one of his own men, slipping away into the shadows. His heart sank. The mole. Joe's mind raced, but there was no time to hesitate. He had to stop him, or everything they had fought for would be in vain. Joe called out to Johnny, his voice sharp. "Cover me. I'll take care of this." Johnny nodded, moving quickly to provide support. Joe pushed through the firefight, his mind solely focused on the traitor. He moved with purpose, his every step calculated. As he cornered the mole, the man turned, eyes wide with fear. "Joe, I..." The words were cut short as Joe stepped closer, his face cold. "You're dead to me, Joe," said his voice low but deadly. With a single precise motion, he ended it. The traitor fell to the ground, and the silence that followed was deafening. Joe stood over him, his heart pounding. The FBI may have been in his home, but it was the betrayal from within that almost broke him. The gunfire slowed, and the chaos gradually faded. The safe house was eerily quiet, except for the distant sound of sirens growing closer. Joe wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath heavy, but there was no time to rest. The FBI was still out there, but Joe had taken care of the most immediate threat. His men moved quickly, tending to the wounded, preparing for the next move. "We've got to go now," Joe ordered. There was no room for hesitation. The FBI would regroup, and Joe knew they would come for him with even more force. His eyes scanned the room, making sure every man was accounted for. "It's not over yet," he muttered to himself, his mind already working on their next escape plan. His men gathered around him, ready for the next fight. But Joe couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The war wasn't won. It had just begun. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway as Joe Colombo and his men moved swiftly through the abandoned building. Their faces were set with determination, but a sense of urgency hung in the air. The escape had been planned down to the last detail, but even now, with the end in sight, the tension was palpable. Joe's mind raced. The FBI was closing in, but his focus was sharp. He couldn't afford any mistakes, not now. His plan had been executed with precision, But there was one thing Joe couldn't shake, the feeling that they were walking right into another trap. As they reached the back exit, Joe stopped for a moment, glancing over his shoulder. His men waited, watching him. "Stay sharp," he ordered. "We're not out of the woods yet." With one final look at the darkened building, Joe led his men out into the night. The air was cold, the streets quiet, but the danger was far from over. This was just the beginning of their escape, and Joe knew it would take everything he had to survive. The streets were eerily silent as Joe's men moved quickly down the alleyway, their eyes darting around, alert for any sign of the FBI. Joe's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the distant sirens, a reminder that time was running out. The FBI would be on their heels, and they needed to get to the safe house before it was too late. "We don't have much time," Joe said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to move faster." His men nodded, their steps quickening as they followed him through the narrow streets. Joe couldn't afford to make a single mistake now. The path ahead was treacherous, and the FBI was closing in. But even as the tension rose, there was something else on Joe's mind, the constant feeling that someone was watching them. It was a nagging thought, but he couldn't ignore it. He pushed it aside for the moment, focusing on the task at hand. Their survival depended on getting to the safe house first, and Joe wasn't about to let the FBI stop him now. They reached the safe house, and Joe's men immediately went to work securing the area. Joe stood back for a moment, surveying the scene. The building was old, but it had served its purpose over the years. It was as close to a sanctuary as they had now. But even here, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that they were exposed. The FBI had been hunting them for too long, and their escape was too easy. Something didn't sit right. As he entered the safe house, Joe's mind raced. "Johnny, check the perimeter. I want eyes on every exit," Joe ordered. Johnny nodded and moved out. Joe turned to the others. "We can't afford to get comfortable. The moment we let our guard down, that's when they'll strike." His voice was firm, but inside, his nerves were beginning to fray. He had faced countless enemies in his life, but this felt different. The pressure was mounting, and Joe wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it all together. It wasn't long before Johnny returned, his face grim. "Joe, we've got a problem," he said. "There's someone out there. I saw them, FBI agents, closing in on the building." Joe's stomach dropped. He had known this was coming, but hearing it from Johnny made it all too real. The FBI was closing in on the safe house. The pressure had finally reached its breaking point. "How many?" Joe asked, his voice steady despite the panic rising within him. "At least 5, maybe more," Johnny replied. Joe nodded. "Get everyone ready. We don't have much time." He turned to the rest of the men. "We're not waiting for them to come to us. We fight our way out." The tension in the room grew thicker, the men's faces hardening. They knew the risks, but there was no other choice. Joe had always taught them to fight when cornered, and that's exactly what they were going to do. The FBI had no idea what they were walking into. Joe Colombo wasn't going down without a fight. The safe house was quiet for a moment, as Joe's men prepared. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. Joe glanced around at his crew, his brothers in arms. Some were nervous, others were focused, but all were ready to fight. Joe knew this could be their last stand. The FBI was closing in, and their chances of escaping were dwindling. He couldn't let them fall apart now. "We do this together," Joe said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "This is our last chance to end it all." He looked each man in the eye, making sure they understood the stakes. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had fought for. "Stay sharp. We're getting out of here, one way or another." With those words, Joe turned, leading his men to the front door. The final confrontation with the FBI was about to begin, and Joe was prepared to burn everything down to survive. The night air was thick with tension as Joe and his men moved toward their final confrontation. Every step was measured, calculated, but Joe's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been through countless battles, but this one felt different. The FBI had them cornered, and every escape route was blocked. "We're running out of time," Johnny whispered as he checked the ammunition in his gun. Joe nodded, his face grim. "We'll fight our way out. No one's taking me alive." He turned to his men, the sharpness in his eyes piercing the dim light. "This is it. We fight for everything. Family, loyalty, our lives. We don't give up." His men nodded, their resolve hardening as they fell into position. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps grew louder. The FBI was closing in. The time to act was now. Joe's voice rang out one last time. "Let's end this." The door to the safe house suddenly crashed open, and the FBI stormed in, guns drawn. Chaos erupted as the sound of gunfire filled the air. Joe's men fired back with precision, but the overwhelming force of the FBI threatened to push them back. Joe's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he ducked behind cover. His mind was sharp, calculating. Every move had to be perfect. He peeked around the corner, taking out 2 agents with swift shots. "Keep moving, don't let them close in," Joe shouted to his men. The walls of the safe house rattled as bullets slammed into the structure. Every corner seemed like an open target. Joe's eyes scanned the room. He needed a way out. But the enemy was closing in from all sides. His mind worked frantically, the weight of his choices and his crew's survival pressing on him. The fight raged on, and Joe's men were starting to show signs of fatigue. Sweat beaded on their foreheads, their movements slower, more deliberate. Joe could see it, the fear. But he couldn't afford to show any weakness. "Stay sharp," he bellowed. "We end this now." The FBI had the advantage in numbers, but Joe's crew had something the agents didn't: determination and a willingness to die for their cause. Joe moved with purpose, taking down one agent after another, his eyes focused solely on the task at hand. But as he turned a corner, he spotted an unexpected sight. An agent had a gun trained on one of his men, Johnny. Without thinking, Joe fired, hitting the agent dead in the chest. Johnny looked up, gratitude and determination flashing in his eyes. "Thanks, Joe," he said, his voice breathless. Joe simply nodded. "We're not done yet." The firefight had lasted far longer than Joe had expected, but they had made a significant dent in the FBI's numbers. Joe's body was sore, his breathing heavy. The room was littered with the fallen, both his men and the FBI. The safe house, once a sanctuary, was now a war zone. But they weren't done yet. Joe gathered his men in the center of the room. "We've got one shot at this," he said, his voice low but firm. "We need to get to the back exit. Once we're out, we move fast." His men nodded, their eyes reflecting the grim determination that had gotten them this far. As Joe turned toward the back door, he heard the unmistakable sound of reinforcements approaching. "Let's move, now!" Joe shouted. The men hurried to the back exit, the sound of their footsteps heavy in the tense silence. The final phase of their escape had begun. Joe and his men burst through the back exit, the cold night air hitting them as they rushed down an alleyway. Their breaths were heavy, their bodies bruised and battered. But they were alive. The streetlights flickered ahead, signaling their path to escape. "We've got to keep moving," Joe muttered. But as they made their way toward the getaway car, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sirens were growing louder, and the path ahead was getting narrower. He turned to his men. "Move fast, no slowing down." But just as they were about to make it to the car, a loud crash echoed from the alleyway. The FBI had followed them. They were trapped. Joe's heart raced as he reached for his gun. "We fight through. We don't give up," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. This was it, his last chance to survive, and he wasn't going down without a fight. The alley was dark and narrow, filled with the sound of hurried footsteps and the distant wail of sirens. Joe and his men made their way toward the getaway car, hearts pounding in their chests. Every step was crucial, and every breath was heavy with the knowledge that the end was near. "Get in the car," Joe barked, urgency in his voice. His men rushed to comply, but just as they neared the vehicle, a barrage of gunfire erupted from the shadows. The FBI had them cornered. Joe spun around, his gun already in his hand, the weight of the situation crushing down on him. "This is it," Joe muttered, his eyes scanning the street for an escape. There was nowhere left to run, and no time left to think. He had spent his life dodging the law, but now it seemed the walls were closing in for good. The only option left was to fight, and Joe was ready to burn everything down if that's what it took. Joe's eyes darted around the alley, his mind racing. The FBI agents were closing in from both sides, and the only way out was through them. "We don't have time for hesitation," Joe shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He motioned to his men to follow him. As the first wave of agents emerged from the shadows, Joe opened fire, the sound of the gunshots ringing in the air. His men followed suit, returning fire with precision. The alleyway became a battleground, the air thick with smoke and the sharp scent of gunpowder. Every move felt like a final decision, every step a step closer to death. But Joe wasn't going down without a fight. He had built his empire on survival, and he would die fighting for it. As the gunfire echoed around him, he caught a glimpse of the getaway car in the distance. "Keep moving," he yelled, but the sound of approaching reinforcements made it clear they wouldn't make it much further. The gunfire slowed for a brief moment as the FBI regrouped, but Joe's men were running low on ammunition, and the weight of the fight was starting to show. Joe's mind raced. He needed a plan, and fast. "We're running out of options," Johnny shouted as he ducked behind cover. Joe's jaw clenched. He knew Johnny was right. They were surrounded, and reinforcements were coming in. "No one gets left behind," Joe said, his voice steady and unwavering. He turned to his men, eyes locking with each one. "We fight until the very end. We make them pay for every step they take." Joe motioned for his men to make a break for the car. As they started to move, gunfire erupted again, forcing them back into cover. Joe's heart raced. It seemed impossible, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. There had to be another way out. "Cover me," Joe shouted, his determination making it clear he would fight for every breath. The final moments were a blur. Joe's men, battered and bruised, were starting to falter under the weight of the fight, but Joe's resolve never wavered. The sound of sirens grew louder, and the lights from police cars flickered like an incoming storm. Joe could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Every breath felt like it might be his last. But then, just as the situation seemed most hopeless, something unexpected happened. From the shadows a figure appeared, one of Joe's most trusted allies, a man who had vanished months ago. The figure opened fire on the FBI agents, throwing off their timing, and allowing Joe's crew a moment of relief. "You're late," Joe shouted, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and gratitude. The ally gave a grim smile. "I wasn't about to let you die alone." With renewed energy, Joe's men fought back harder, pushing the FBI agents back, but the fight was far from over. The final push was brutal. Joe and his men fought with everything they had left, taking down FBI agents one by one. The sound of gunfire and shouts filled the air as they moved toward the exit. But as they neared the getaway car, the unthinkable happened. A sharp pain exploded in Joe's side, and he stumbled, his gun falling from his hand. The world seemed to slow as he fell to his knees, blood soaking through his shirt. His men rushed to his side, but Joe raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "No, you keep going," he gasped, his voice weak but determined. "You make sure this fight wasn't for nothing." Johnny's face twisted with grief. "Joe, no. We'll get you out of here." But Joe shook his head. "It's over for me, but not for you. Don't let them win." With a final defiant look at his men, Joe closed his eyes. He had fought for everything, and in the end, he paid the ultimate price. The war was over, but the price of loyalty had been his life.